this is Saad for the Sad Truth. I wanted to first express my deepest sorrow at yet another senseless, brutal, uncivilized, grotesque attack on innocent people. This in a daily, never-ending global carnage and mayhem that is being meted against people from all walks of life and all corners of the globe. In any case, today I wanted to offer a way of understanding some of the current realities using some biological examples. I thought that would be instructive as we navigate through some of these issues. So when I typically discuss evolutionary psychology, I will often hear from some detractors who levy things like, oh, but it's biologically deterministic, it's genetic determinism. And then I have to explain to them, as have other colleagues within the evolutionary sciences, that nothing could be further from the truth. And typically we talk about an interactionist framework when we talk about evolutionary psychology, namely the idea that it is always the case that our evolved biological blueprints interact with the environment to create our unique realities, right? And so we could think about, for example, the fact that men have evolved the desire to seek social status precisely because women desire social status, but any individual man may pursue that exact Darwinian goal in different ways depending on his idiosyncratic talents. And so some might become famous soccer players, others might become politicians, others might become great artists, others might become famous professors. But the idea is that there is an underlying biological imperative which is then instantiated in different ways depending on the unique circumstances of the individual. If we take this at a lower level of analysis, say at the level of genes, genes themselves are either turned on or off as a result of environmental inputs, right? And so nothing could be clearer about the fact that everything in biology is ultimately an interaction between, well, biology and the environment. Now, how do we link this to the current realities that we're facing? Islam is codified in a set of texts. These texts exist as is. There's the Quran, there's the Hadith, there is the Sirah, the biography of Muhammad. Now, different individuals can interact with those texts in different ways. Different cultures can interact with those texts in different ways. The texts themselves remain the same. There is no radical Islam. There is no violent, militant, extremism. There is Islam, as has been stated by very prominent Muslim leaders and theologians. Erdogan basically stated recently, there is no moderate Islam. Islam is Islam. And there are many others that have intimated the exact same thing. So an individual can interact. So think again of the gene and the environmental inputs. Think again of the example I gave you from evolutionary psychology. An individual can interact with those texts in different ways, yielding different outcomes. He could ignore a lot of the edicts in those texts. He could not be aware of those edicts. He could reinterpret those edicts. But in any case, what doesn't change is the content of those edicts. So we can't talk about gun control and truck control and solar panels and foreign policy. The issue lies with the texts. Now, tons of people who proclaim adherence to those texts, as I said, interact with those texts in ways that, from a doctrinal perspective, are incorrect, right? If you choose to ignore in Judaism the edict to not eat pork, that doesn't make you somebody who practices non-radical, non-militant Judaism. You're not eating pork, or you are eating pork, despite the fact that Judaism does not allow you to eat pork. So again, we have to understand how this reality comes to be. Why is it that Jains are not reading their holy texts, and then some of the Jains are interpreting those texts in ways that asks them to kill endless people? Well, because there is nothing in the DNA of Jainism that would yield such an outcome. It would be extraordinarily unlikely that there'd be an interaction between an individual and Jainist doctrines that would result in a Jain becoming a violent killer. And so we could keep tangoing around the issue, we can keep obfuscating, we can try to come up with all sorts of niceties to hide the problem, avoid the problem, reject the reality as the problem. But the problem couldn't be any clearer. It is as clear as the existence of gravity. The texts are what they are, and then different people interact with those texts in different ways. If they choose to ignore the context of those texts, that doesn't make them followers of a moderate version of the religion. It simply makes them people who, because of the random combination of their genes that define their personhood, choose to ignore those texts. Okay? So please remember how to navigate through this issue. And until we have a frank, honest discussion of this issue, the problem will persist and it will only get worse.